Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending our webinar today on 5 of the basic principles that go into effective dashboard design. My name is Ricky. I'm a solutions architect here at Dundas, but I want to make very clear that today's presentation is a crowdsourced effort. Contributions from the solution architects, the consultants, even our dashboard associates and support have all had a piece of putting together what we believe are 5 very basic but very important principles around putting together an effective dashboard. So why are we here? Why do we feel like we need to announce some of our guiding principles to you, some of our prospective clients and current clients, and also people who've discovered us on the website? I was browsing the web a couple weeks ago, visiting some blogs that I like to check up on. This one was recommended to me by one of our internal UI UX experts. It's Nielsen Norman Group, and they do a lot of research into user interface and user design. And they recently published an article on conversion rate. Now, the article itself is pretty interesting, really focusing on when you design a website, when you design anything that relies on user interaction, how do you define success with that? And more specifically, how likely are users going to interact with what you've designed in the way that you want them to? So really great article, really long, really intense science, really good points. And then at the end of the article, they write this paragraph. And I'm going to sort of change the highlighting here for you to see why it's of interest to me. Is, the potential scenario that they described, the company could be making to look, an extra $100,000 a month. So to a small company, this could be a big number. But the odds are this isn't even going to matter, because the interesting data that they've exposed as part of this study, the interesting data to the users, odds are very good. It's just going to sit in a report somewhere and no one's ever going to use it. This is bad news. This is business gone wrong. That presentation layer of your BI stack, of all that technology that you've got in place to collect information and to show you how your business is going, that presentation layer is how you're going to have a window into that. And if your reports aren't well designed, if your dashboards aren't well designed, you're going to have big problems, making informed decisions and coming up with results that you're looking for. So with that in mind, the 5 basic design principles that we're going to share with you today. Simple ways that you can make your dashboards easier to read and act upon. Now, this is just a small subset of all of the possibilities in designing dashboards. Each one of these points could be a presentation in itself. I could go on for days about this, but we want to start by sort of moving you away from something like this. This is something that we see quite a bit in terms of a first pass at dashboard design from clients, from potential clients. Everybody has seen pie charts in marketing all over the place, those stacked bar charts down at the bottom. This is just an example of, we're not really sure what we're going to do with this information, so let's just stick to something that we've seen a lot of before. This is very difficult to read. It's very difficult to me to make any sort of decision based on this. So I want to get you to a space where you're going to take something like this as a first draft and refine it into something like this. A lot less noise, a lot less clutter, a lot more focus on actionable metrics. So here we go. The first one is a freebie, and I'm calling it point 0. This is something that should be the foundation of anything you do, is make sure you have the right metrics before you even begin designing your dashboard. I don't want you to have to continually go back to the drawing board with your dashboard because you're refining what you're looking to measure. So I understand that KPI definition, that monitoring metrics is an iterative process, but at least set a standing point in terms of knowing what your key performance indicators are, knowing what your targets are going to be, and knowing exactly who your audience is for anything that you're going to be designing. So before you even start, make sure you're measuring the right thing. So rule number 1, choose the right visualization for each metric. Now, this seems blatantly obvious, but the way that we decide on the right visual treatment for every metric isn't always as obvious as it seems. I want you to ask very specific questions of your audience. What exactly are we measuring? What are the relevant dimensions? And I don't mean which ones are available, I mean which ones are relevant. Time is something most transactions in a business will have a timestamp. If the time that transaction took place isn't relevant, don't put it on the dashboard. You don't need a million filters on every dashboard. Narrow down your filter set to the ones that are actually going to have impact. Narrow down the selectable dimensions to the ones that are going to have impact. Who is using the metric? So do they know enough about the data that you're presenting that you can sort of hold back on some context? Or maybe you need a different visual treatment for the data just based on who it is that's going to be consuming it. And what are they using it for? Are they measuring a trend? Is it a point in time? Is it something where precision is necessary? These are all things that are going to be part of your decision process in moving away from pie charts and tables and into something a little more visually rich and meaningful. So, as an example, let's take a scenario I've used in previous webinars where we've got a team manager managing her agents on her team. So she wants to monitor an overall trend over the last 12 weeks. I would suggest a line chart. In this case, I suggest a series of spark lines, which I'll talk about a little later. But line charts are great for trends. We can see a point moving through time. If she wants a snapshot, how are things going this week? I'd suggest a set of indicators like these bullet graphs. Now, they're also great for comparison within a set. So I can easily, just by scanning the length of each of these indicators by agent, I can tell which ones are lagging behind, which ones are excelling, and where I need to take action. So line charts, indicators, and although I try and shy away from filling a dashboard with tables, in a case where precision is required, where it's absolutely necessary to know the exact number of particular events, tables are still the way to go. There's nothing easier to read than a number. But be careful with this because it's difficult to provide context in a situation like this, and context is something I'll talk about a bit later. So 3 different visuals here, all informed by the 4 questions on the left-hand side. Really dig in. Don't just slap a pie chart on there. Dig in and find out what it's going to be used for before you even pick the visual design of the metric. Now, I tend to stick to the simplest and easiest to read visualization types. Unless you're in a specialized field or you're dealing with specialized analysts who are used to seeing things in a particular way, I tend to suggest not deviating from this subset of the visuals. Our tool does include 50 plus different visuals, and they are there for you. But again, think really hard before you deviate from something that's simply easy to read. Are you going to have time to educate your audience in terms of how to read a particular scatter plot or something with a large number of axes and dimensions? So bullet graphs, I don't like radial gauges. They take up a lot of space. They're not super meaningful unless they're well configured. So if you're going to be showing an indicator, I tend to recommend sticking to bullet graphs, which I showed you on a previous slide. Bar graphs are a great way to compare items within a category. So in this case, we have 5 different categories of call that are coming in. It's easy for me to see, which one is the most voluminous, which one is the least. Data labels, as I said, there's nothing easier to read than a number, but when I talk about context, I'll explain how sometimes numbers can be dangerous in isolation. Line graphs for trends. Where precision isn't super necessary, as long as I can see that we're around 100 at any particular point in time, that's going to be okay. I'm just trying to get a feel for the shape of the trend. Are we heading upward? Are we heading downward? Where are my peaks and valleys? Spark lines, which I showed you earlier, they're condensed line charts where the value is not at all of interest. I'm just trying to really hone in on the shape, and I'm comparing the shape within a set. So the top item, there were some earlier peaks, but now we're on the way up. That's great. The one underneath it, we've sort of plateaued a bit. Maybe we need to understand what's going on there. So state indicators, it's a fancy way of calling a symbol. So you can see this is a list of students, and there is something of such significance about the first 3 students on this list that we've decided to put a state indicator beside them to draw the user's eye immediately to them. You need to pay special attention to these 3 items. State indicators are very often misused in terms of I would see very commonly on this table, every single one of these would have a state indicator. And we would use red for the poor performers and green for the good performers. Well, I would argue if you're only interested in the poor performers because that's where your action is going to focus, you don't need to highlight the good performers. So use state indicators with a bit of discretion. And again, tabular data, the tables that we're used to from Excel, if you're in a situation where precision is important and the context is within the user's brain, they'll immediately understand on that top row what a 2 is, what they need to do about it. Then tables are absolutely fine for displaying data. So that is the tool set that I tend to stick to. So we're going to talk a little bit now about configuring that tool set. So when you put a visual on your dashboard, do not distort the underlying data with the visual treatment. The information needs to be the focus. And what am I speaking about here? Things like this, a 3D pie chart, where the visual treatment of this, that we've sort of skewed it out, we've laid it on an imaginary 3D plane here, is actually getting in the way of my users actually being able to use this chart. Those 2 tiny wedges in the back corner there, how different are they? Are they the same value? Which one is larger? How do they relate in proportion to either of the larger regions? It's getting in the way because it's flattened out. When you think about what you would use a pie chart for, you want to compare the area of each wedge, and now my brain has to do extra arithmetic to sort of flatten that out. It's just bad. Now I could flatten it and it would get a little better, but I still argue that this is a bad treatment for this visual because when I look at this, my brain isn't immediately going to be able to say that green area is this much bigger than that purple area. So we're still, kind of far away from our purpose here, which is determining the proportion of each of these data points in relation to each other. So what I would suggest in a situation like this is something that happens very frequently, where we're looking at portions of a whole and trying to understand for each data point what is their contribution to the whole. I'm going to suggest if you have more than 2 data points, do not use a pie chart. Use a simple line chart, something like this, where I've directly labeled each data point. It's very easy to read. It's where the eye is naturally going to flow to the end of each line. I'm using a technique we call, many people call it negative space there with the grid lines to sort of section off each line. So you can see that the top one is about 6, the second one is about 2. So very easy for me to make a comparison between the 2 items. So this is my suggestion. This is a way that I would use the visual to enhance the understanding of the underlying data instead of getting in the way. So I've mentioned context a couple times through the presentation, and context is extremely important. You have to provide on your dashboard enough information for your metrics to be usable. So in the case of this line chart, I'm talking about the quantitative scale. So in the case of a line chart, as I said, as long as I'm kind of around in the area of the value, a quantitative scale will be of importance on the chart. The target, we have a service level agreement in place with regard to the data underneath this line chart. I want the target on the line chart. I want it laid out and very visible, so it's quickly and easily identifiable as a user. Where am I above target? Where are my problem points? What do I need to address? I want you to have a target on absolutely every metric on your dashboard wherever possible. And finally, I've got a different visual treatment for the areas where I've exceeded that target. So I tend to use color sparingly, but this is an example of where I might suggest using some color, is where I'm exceeding that target, highlight it with a different visual treatment, the same way that we did with the state indicators earlier in the webinar. So this is all context. This is all information that's going to make your data richer and easier to action. I tend to put interactivity, so clicking on the dashboard and changing the view, I put it in the category of context. It's a way to just support the decision making based on that individual metric with some supporting or underlying data. So as an example, I've got a line chart. Maybe I've configured it so the user can click on a single data point and get a pop-up with a bit of detail about what's contributing to that data point. So put interactivity in the category of context. Think very carefully about where you are allowing interactivity. Think, is it going to absolutely influence decisions if I click on this data point and get the underlying data? If not, don't put it on your dashboard. Also, be very careful about interactivity. Be very careful when you navigate away from a visual, because human short-term memory is terrible with regard to facts and figures. I read a study recently that we can hold on to about 7 facts for about 30 seconds, and then it's gone. So if you're going to set up a secondary view of data and it relies on the primary view in order to make sense, keep that primary view visible in a case like this where I've got a pop-up or a hover over, or actually show it on the second screen, so that context is always available. So context is very important. Interactivity is part of that tool set of context that I want you to think quite a bit about when you include it in your dashboards. I personally don't believe that every dashboard needs to have interactivity, but the team as a whole firmly believes that it makes the dashboard suite a lot richer and makes the user feel like they're a lot more involved in the decision-making process. Point number 4, good design is as little design as possible. So make every pixel count. So really think about absolutely everything you're going to put on your dashboard. Is branding really necessary? Well, if it's something that's external facing or you're looking to reinforce who you are to your internal stakeholders, then yes, branding is necessary. But keep it inobtrusive and display it in a way that it does not detract from the decision-making process based on your dashboard. So I categorize a lot of what's on this dashboard as clutter, as wasted pixels. I called it 40%. My team told me they thought I was being generous with that 40% in terms of absolutely wasted space, wasted pixels on this dashboard. Dashboards do not need to look like a car. It's not important. It's not relevant. My team went as far as to start tearing into the color selection, that weird odometer type treatment on each of the pie charts in the middle, the fact that none of this looks like a cohesive package. There is a lot on this dashboard that is just clutter. It's just noise, and I don't want to see it on my dashboards, and I don't think your users want to see it either. So pay attention to something that we call, that the experts in the field have called for 3 decades now, the data ink ratio. So what this means is you take all of the ink used on your dashboard and you use that as the divisor for all of the ink you're using to actually present data, all of the actual data points. And you want that to be close to 1 in a lot of cases. You want to really pay attention to, if I'm going to use pixels, if I'm going to use a different visual treatment for anything that isn't data, is it absolutely 100% necessary? And if it isn't, don't put it on your dashboard. And this even counts on individual visualizations, like this bar chart. I would consider this something that has very low data ink ratio. I think that a lot of the ink, and in this case I'm using the term ink contrasted with pixels very carefully, because in some cases I'm not actually going to remove color from a pixel. I'm just going to change it a bit. But I think a lot of the ink, I think a lot of the visual effort on this bar chart is just detracting. It's getting in the way. It's not adding to the absorption of the data. So I'm going to put this through a series of transformations to bring it to a high data ink ratio, something that I think is very usable. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of those backgrounds. I don't think they add anything. I think that the charts and graphs themselves are enough to sort of differentiate the metric from the other pieces on the screen. So I don't want that color in the background. I'm going to get rid of the frames as well, using the same argument that the fact that it's a bar chart in isolation is enough to sort of frame it on its own. This is something that needs to be digested as a whole. I'm going to get rid of the colors, the visual effects, and the grid lines, because I think they're just noise. Now, the grid lines I'll defend a little later. The colors, in a case where, let's say, this bar chart is one of 4 or 5 different bar charts that all have these same states on them, you could argue that Florida, if I make Florida blue on each of those bar charts, it's going to be easy for the user to come in and say, hey, those are all Florida. I understand the story that you're telling about Florida. And that's a case where, you know what, go for it. If you're conservative about it, then using that color to sort of group items across visuals, it makes good sense. Go for it. But as I'm presenting it here in isolation, I don't think that color is necessary. I want to reduce the font weights. So the context is important. So it's important for the user to know what the subject of this graph is and what each individual category is. In this case, there's states. But I don't think it's the most important. The first thing I want my user to do is sort of absorb the shape of the bars and then understand, okay, here are the high ones, look down and see which ones are the high ones, which one are the low ones. So I'm going to do that by reducing the focus on the text and putting it squarely on the visual. One thing that I like to do on bar charts is direct label. So instead of making the user sort of look at the bar and then look over to the axis on the left-hand side, it's easier for me and actually much more useful to just simply directly label each bar chart or each bar on the chart. So I'm getting both the impression of the length and the actual value behind the length in one visual stop on the dashboard at the very end of the bar. Stop users, having to bounce around the chart to actually understand the data behind it. So on the left is where we finished, on the right is where we started. Now, I kind of believe that even on the left-hand side, it's a better visual treatment. It's much more elegant, it's much more modern. I've had one person uncharitably describe the bar chart on the right-hand side as Christmas at the circus. It's just overwhelming. There's too much going on. It's getting in the way. And just as an aside, on the left-hand side, I would think about how we're organizing those bars. So in the story that I told, where this is going to be part of a package of bar charts all pointed at the same states, it might make sense to sort them in alphabetical order. But if I'm trying to see where my successes are, or I'm trying to see who's lagging behind, I would order this in either descending or ascending order of the data points, as opposed to simply alphabetically. But that's something that's not quite part of the Data Inc. discussion, but something that my team wanted to make sure that I mentioned. So our last point, the first 4 have been a bit more about like configuring items on the dashboard. Now I want to talk about how the dashboard is consumed. So consider your medium. How are your dashboards going to be viewed? Do you have mobile users? And the odds are very good that you do have mobile users. Cisco completed a survey, and this is 3 years. This is getting pretty stale at this point. But even at that time, 60% of workers felt that they didn't need to be in the office to be productive. And I know feeling productive and being productive may be different, but the point at least stands is that users fully expect to be able to consume, to do their work, to consume their reports on their mobile devices. And at least in our platform, it's really easy to enable them to do that. But I think you should think specifically about your mobile users while you're doing design. For example, users are even less likely to scroll and pinch and rotate on a phone than they are to scroll on a web page on a desktop. There's studies, lots of studies on even on that Nielsen blog that show you they're not going to do it, or if they do it, they're not going to be happy about it. So if you take a cell phone user and you share with them this desktop design dashboard at a very high resolution, because we're all using 22-inch monitors or whatever, and they try and get some sort of impression of what's going on in this dashboard, they're going to get very frustrated very quickly and give up, or have to pinch and pinch and pinch. Or if you set your page to automatically determine how big the browser window is and scale to it, this is going to be microscopic. It's not going to be usable. So be considerate to your mobile users and design something that they're going to be able to immediately read without having to pinch and scroll and drag. This is a little more relevant on the phone, less relevant now that we're all using our iPad 2s or iPads with the Retina display. But the smaller screens, the pixel density, it makes it even more of a consideration to be very judicious in how much screen real estate you use with each visual, and I really consider hiding anything that isn't of utmost importance to be a much stronger need even on the mobile side than the desktop side. So in our case in Dundas, we introduced a mobile home screen where instead of building a giant dashboard, we prepare a set of small tiles, and each one of these small tiles is really condensed information, summary metrics, and in our platform you can click on it and move to a bigger dashboard. But really think about how much you're going to present on a single screen, how much is an actual decision driver. You can see I've even reduced the context here to short forms in a lot of cases, and just overall impressions as opposed to actuals, where all the impressions are enough to drive the point home. So again, be conscious of the screen size and be conscious of how much you display on that smaller screen. And then this is an interesting one, but there's kind of a pretty interesting distribution of the way people hold their phones. Most of the time it's in one hand or the other, or it's cradled with a tap. So what this means is when you do add any of that interactivity, when there are buttons to be pushed and filters to be interacted with, put them in a place where, number one, their hand isn't going to overlap any of the data, and number two, where their hands are already located. So in the case of these tiles that I'm displaying on the smartphone, the tiles that I want them to click on are down at the bottom and they're in the middle. They're clicked often, so make it easy for them to click at them and drive it. And the buttons that I don't want them clicking on either ever or at the end of their session to log out or something they're not going to access very frequently, put them up at the top and get them out of the way. And this is, in some cases, a little reverse to the way you design on a desktop, right? You want your all of your filters sort of grouped up in an area together, and you're not super conscious of where you put them because the mouse is kind of everywhere. So even in terms of your interactivity, consider that you need to treat it a little differently on the mobile phone. So that's it. In summary, here's the 5 things I went through today, including our freebie, which is make sure you're even measuring the right thing before you start designing. But go through your metrics and pick the right visual treatment for each of them. Make sure that when you put it on a dashboard, you're showing the data and the visual treatment isn't getting in the way. Provide enough context for each item to be immediately actionable. Make sure that your design is enhancing the usability and not getting away from it. Good design is really as little design as possible, and consider your medium. Make sure that you're understanding where this is going to be displayed before you even start designing.